minutes later. But
All right. Maybe I'll zone back in. Maybe I'm just going to stay zoned out. Let's see. Okay. Matthew 5. We're going to do some narrative setup. Where is he? What's happening in his life and ministry? And then we're going to talk through some of the beginning pieces of this and what in at least some of the first stages to what's happening here in Matthew 5 through 7, because remember, this is one long extended piece of Jesus' ministry. We're going to talk through some of the beginning pieces of it that are going to orient the rest. Okay. And then we'll start getting into the specific connections in the teaching to Moses. That'll probably get us to our time frame. We'll cut it off there. Okay. And we'll pick that up again later, depending on how things look today, tomorrow. We might pick it up on Monday. Okay. But I want to be true to my word and give you guys time to work on what you're finishing up for your exam stuff. Okay. So Matthew 5 is where we begin. Woo-hoo. And in Matthew 5 through 7, we're talking about what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. Guess why we call it that? Because it's a sermon he gave on a... Whoa! Mind blown.
Yeah.
All right. This is the Sermon on the Mount. It is probably Jesus' most famous teaching. At least everybody knows Jesus did the Sermon on the Mount. But here's what I find. We're all familiar. Oh, yeah, Sermon on the Mount. That was Jesus. Yeah, on the mountain. Woo! We have no idea what he actually says in it. You're like, oh, yeah, he taught this thing over there, and that might be in the Sermon on the Mount, but we don't necessarily know that it's in the Sermon on the Mount. We're like, oh, yeah, he taught the Sermon on the Mount. And we're like, what did he do? But we don't know what he said in it. Okay? And so we're going to live with this for a few days as far as Matthew's concerned for a couple of reasons. Number one, this is one of the strongest narrative connections, Jesus to Moses. Okay? And so this is some of our setup to what we're doing here as we look at these passages. And a lot of what I'm going to provide you as far as teaching through the New Testament stuff is context or setup you may not necessarily have. And so I bring that to bear, and then we go to the passage together with that new information at your disposal, and we start to rethink the passage. That's kind of the paradigm in second semester. Good? What are those connections? Number one. The setting. In this case, geographically being on the mountainside. Okay. 2, the activity, in this case, teaching. And within that, to use Matthew's phrase, this focus on the kingdom of heaven or on the kingdom of God is a connecting point to us for what Moses taught, because in Exodus 19, God and Moses are having a conversation, and Israel is supposed to be a kingdom of priests. And so Jesus emphasizing this idea of kingdom in the Gospel of Matthew isn't anything necessarily new. That was how the people of God were always supposed to be. The people of God today are supposed to be a kingdom. Right? And God is supposed to be the one who's king of that kingdom. And so there's a manner of life that befits, that is fitting for those who live in a kingdom. And this is part of what we're going to get described for us. You with me? Okay, so setting, activity, content. Now that we know we're talking about teaching, we're talking about the kingdom of heaven and and our lives in that kingdom, then we can say in a general sense that the sermon is primarily concerned with a manner of life that belongs to those who live in the kingdom. Right? If we were to say that of Moses, we would talk about the law. We're uncomfortable with that terminology when it relates to Jesus, because something in our 21st century Western Christianity doesn't like Jesus as a lawgiver. Feels too legal, too legalistic. It gets too out of the relationship and into the rules. You follow me on that? But there is a sense in this manner of life conversation that Jesus is giving law. Okay, and here we have to understand a couple of things. When the Bible does law, it does law in one of two ways. The first of them is descriptive law. Descriptive law describes character or holiness. Okay? It sketches out what people ought to look like or live like. And then there's prescriptive law. Prescriptive law is the specific do's and don'ts. Do these things, don't do those things, avoid that stuff, engage with this stuff, right? So prescriptive tells you, don't eat pork. I mean, if we're talking Moses, right? Because thankfully we live under the law that Jesus gave us, and so bacon's on the table. Like, literally. Okay? With me on that? Okay. Prescriptive tells you, don't steal. Descriptive says, this is what holiness is like as you live and relate to God. This is what your character should be like as you live and relate to God and relate to others. Okay? Here's our setup. So, how about the passage then? Here's how it starts. Chapter 5, verse 1. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are those who mourn, they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how will its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Ooh. You are the light of the world. The city on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all that are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. This is all foundational stuff for Jesus. At this point, there's a lot of descriptive in here. This is what it looks like to live as somebody who belongs in the kingdom. And so the first 16 verses is descriptive. Kingdom citizens are poor in spirit. They hunger and thirst for righteousness. They're persecuted for righteousness' sake. They're peacemakers. You with me here? Okay. Then he launches into a section about fulfilling the law. And then in 21 through chapter 5, 48, right? So 21 through 48 in chapter 5. He goes into a section where he quotes something from the law. You have heard it said. And then he offers you but now I tell you. And here's what he's doing. In this section, You've heard it said. Here's the law. Here's the deal. Here's the instruction. This is what you know. And every time he says, you have heard it said, he gives you some action. Okay. You have heard it said, do not murder. You have heard it said, do not commit adultery. You have heard it said, don't swear falsely. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Love your neighbor, hate your enemies. You've heard it said every time. And he gives you some action that you have heard and that you have been taught to follow through on. Then he says, but I tell you, and he's going to problematize the action sequence. You ready? Okay. If you came in here and I said, don't cheat. Is that relatively easy as an action? It's pretty simple. Do your own stuff. Don't look at anybody else's stuff. Don't use stuff you're not supposed to. It's fairly straightforward. The action itself, right? Okay. But if we take those actions and we turn them into attitudes of the heart, that's a little more problematic.
It's called the beatitude.
We'll come back to that, but you're not wrong. Turns the actions into attitudes of the heart. So don't cheat. That's the academically honest thing to do, right? Okay. But really, is it academically honest to just come into a classroom and never cheat? No, the genuine, most truly academically honest thing that you could do would be to come in and fully engage in the learning process. But which one's more complicated? Coming in every day and being actively and fully engaged in your learning process. We'll just use this particular classroom as an example. That's more complicated, isn't it? Because at least on some days, your internal state or your level of exhaustion or frustration makes it more complicated to fully engage with what it is we're doing in here. Yeah? Okay. But even then, we're talking about things I can still manage. In some sense, I can manage my level of exhaustion. Right? To some extent, I can manage my frustration. To some extent, I can, okay, fill in the blank. However, what goes on in here, Miller's just up there rambling again. This is ridiculous. I don't want to pay any attention. This dictates a lot of your full engagement, doesn't it? Because you can take notes and you can be engaged in what we're doing and you can be following the lecture process, but not engaging from your core, your soul, your heart, whatever that cool spiritual Christian term we want to add on to that inner person. You with me so far? And we're not doing this. So here's what Jesus does. He says this, don't murder. That's what you've heard. That's relatively easy. Don't kill somebody. Like intentionally. I mean, that's what murder is, right? Don't intentionally kill another human person. Don't do that. I think most of us in the room, hedge my bets here, have managed to accomplish that task. I mean, the fact that we're in the room is evidence to that, so I think we can safely say that. Okay, fair. On the other hand, don't be angry with your brother or sister and lash out at them. That's a different story. But guess what? when Jesus does this, he says, hey, you've heard it said, don't commit murder. But I tell you, if you've been angry at somebody and lashed out at them and mistreated them in that, you're guilty of the other one. Ruh-roh. Basically, what Jesus is doing is saying, hey, it works like this. The outward action, great, you've learned behavior management. The attitude and disposition and actions of your heart, however, those are a bigger issue. And they're just as important as the outward action. Congratulations, you didn't kill anybody today. However, if you were angry and you mistreated people, that's just as problematic. Okay. Managing to get through your day without murdering somebody, I hope, is a relatively easy task. Okay? Ladies, remember that when you're married. Okay? Please, give us a little grace. That's all I'm saying. We need a lot of it on a daily basis. Yeah? Guys, remember how gracious they are to you. Okay? That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. We should be able to get through a day without murdering people. Like that, we should be able to function that way. The vast majority of American society has figured that out. On the other hand, the dispositions and attitudes of my heart, I only have one of them, right? Of our hearts, that's where I wanted to go with that, toward that person. Makes your eyes roll when they walk in the room. You instantly start getting when they start talking. Jesus says, what you're disposed to here, and the way you treat that individual from the heart, is the same thing as the action the law prohibited in the first place. That's a bit more problematic, isn't it? It's a lot like that, hey, don't cheat. Relatively easy. From your attitudes, to your approach, to your follow-through on assignments and tests and quizzes, be fully engaged in the learning process every day. That's a bit more complex, isn't it? It's a bit harder to be as consistent as we want to be in that regard, isn't it? Welcome to what Jesus is doing with the Sermon on the Mount. But where does he start it? All of these actions are related to, in some sense, the law. Don't steal, don't commit adultery. Those are straight out of the Ten Commandments. He's not pulling stuff out of thin air. He's going back to what Moses has already said. Moses told you, don't do this stuff. Moses told you, be nice to your neighbors. I tell you, if somebody hits you in the face, let him hit you again. Amen? Jesus takes what Moses has delivered, and it's powerful, it's effective. Societies have been built on the Ten Commandments, people. It works. But Jesus goes one step further. He says it's not enough that it just works. If you're going to live in the kingdom, then your manner of life, it's got to have a new law attached to it. It's got to have a new righteousness attached to it. It's not just about outward actions, it's about the inward dispositions. Because the reality is, outward actions I like that line. I'm going to use that a lot. Outward actions follow inward dispositions. And so in this first segment of really getting his teeth into teaching from the law, in chapter 5, Jesus spends his time talking about the fact that what we do outwardly demonstrates the disposition of the heart. And he uses the stuff in Moses as the primary example. And it circles back to what started the sermon in the Beatitudes. Pure in heart, peacemakers, merciful, hunger and thirst for righteousness, meek, mourn, and poor in spirit. Because if those are the inward dispositions of the heart, then the outward actions follow suit. And individuals with these inward dispositions act it out. And so we're not necessarily going to do it perfectly, but we will work on and grow into the ability of, when we get frustrated, not lashing out and mistreating people in our frustration or anger. Recognizing the value and the dignity of every human person made in the image of God, instead of indulging our lust or selfish desire. Well, it changes the game, doesn't it? Okay. This is the first step in understanding what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? We will pick this up later. All right? You have the rest of your time to work on your exam stuff. Good?